My mother tried to take my house in front of 12-year-olds, birthday cake, and half the neighborhood. The patio was strung with pink lanterns. My daughter Ellie's friends were running in and out of the kitchen in paper crowns. And Mrs. Grant from next door was tying ribbons to the fence because she believed every child should have one birthday each year that looked bigger than life. I was carrying lemonade to the yard when my mother's sedan pulled into the driveway, followed by a white SUV with a real estate magnet on the door. My sister Vanessa stepped out first, dressed like she was arriving for a closing, not a family gathering. My mother came after her with a leather folder pressed against her chest. Then the man from the SUV climbed out holding a clipboard. That was the first moment I understood this was not grief behaving badly. It was a plan. Ellie came up beside me just as they reached the walkway. Two other mothers were near the patio door with paper plates in hand. Mrs. Grant paused mid-knot, ribbon hanging from her fingers. Nobody said anything yet, but the air changed. People know the difference between guests and people who came to do damage. My mother did not greet her granddaughter. She lifted the folder and said, in a voice meant to sound official, "Your father updated his will before he died. This house was not left to you." Vanessa looked past me into the entryway as if checking whether the furniture was still in place. "So let's do this without a scene." Then my mother handed me the document like I was an obstacle standing in the wrong doorway. I looked down. My father's name was on the first page. There was a notary stamp, two witnesses, and a signature close enough to his to fool someone who had not sat beside his bed in the final weeks, watching his hands shake after every dose of medication. He had died 11 weeks earlier. 8 days before that date. He could barely hold a spoon without bracing his wrist. I knew because I had been the one lifting the glass, sorting the pills, changing the sheets, and sleeping on the downstairs sofa so I could hear him if he called at night. Behind me, one of the girls asked if it was time for cake. Nobody answered. My mother kept speaking as if children, neighbors, and humiliation were all minor details. "There is already a buyer prepared to move quickly if you cooperate. We're trying to make this simple. Buyer. Not a conversation. Not probate. Not mourning. A buyer." The man with the clipboard shifted uncomfortably but did not leave. Vanessa folded her arms, calm in that brittle way people get when they think they are standing on winning paper. Ellie slipped her hand into mine. "Mom?" I covered her fingers with mine and kept my face still. I would not give my mother the collapse she had come for. I would not let Vanessa carry a story back to court or family or anyone else about how unstable I looked when confronted. Women like them never just attack. They collect reactions and call them evidence later. "Sweetheart," I said quietly, "take your friends to the backyard. Mrs. Grant will help with the candles." Ellie hesitated. She was old enough to hear the words, "house," and "left to you," and understand that adults were trying to change something permanent. Mrs. Grant rescued the moment with forced brightness, gathering the girls toward the yard. But the noise never fully came back. Even children can feel when a house is being spoken about like loot. Vanessa waited until Ellie was gone. Then let the cruelty show. "You've played devoted daughter long enough." That landed harder than the forged signature, because this house was never just property. It was the only solid thing left after my marriage ended. And my ex-husband moved 3 states away with promises he never kept. It was where Ellie learned to sleep again without checking the front window every time headlights passed. It was where my father spent the last months of his life looking out at the maple tree he planted when I was 6. It was where I paid bills at midnight, managed oxygen deliveries, argued with insurance, and kept the entire structure of daily life standing while my mother visited in polished bursts, and Vanessa arrived just often enough to be seen. They were not trying to take square footage. They were trying to rewrite who had held this family together when holding it still cost something. My mother stepped closer and lowered her voice, as if intimacy could make cruelty respectable. "If you sign an acknowledgement today, we can give you a reasonable time to move out." Reasonable. As if I were a tenant being offered courtesy in the home where my daughter's height marks were still penciled inside the pantry door. I handed the pages back carefully, one clean motion, and looked at her over the top of the folder. "You should leave," I said. She blinked, more offended than surprised. "That is not a response." It is today's response. Vanessa gave a short laugh. You think acting calm changes anything? I looked at the forged will, then at the realtor, then at my mother's face. No, I said. But records do. That was the first crack in the moment. Not because either of them looked frightened. They were too practiced for that. But something shifted. My mother's mouth tightened. Vanessa stopped performing confidence and started measuring risk. They had expected tears, pleading, maybe anger, something messy. Something they could call instability, entitlement, grief. They had not expected me to look at the paper and think about dates, signatures, witnesses, and whose idea it had been to bring a buyer before they had lawful possession of anything. I opened the front door wider behind me. From where they stood, they could see birthday gifts stacked on the console table, wrapping paper near the stairs, strawberries on the kitchen counter, Ellie's sneakers by the hall bench, and the ordinary shape of a life already rooted inside those walls. My life. My daughter's life. My father's final trust. Then I pointed toward the driveway. Get off my property. The other mothers said nothing, but silence can become its own kind of witness. Mrs. Grant had come back to the patio and was standing perfectly still with a spool of ribbon in her hand. The realtor stared at the hydrangeas. Vanessa put her sunglasses back on even though the sun had already shifted behind the oak tree. My mother slid the papers into the folder as if neatness could restore dignity. They turned and left. I waited until both cars backed out. Until the sound of engines disappeared. Until the driveway was empty again. Then I turned and saw Ellie standing just inside the hallway, a single candle still in her hand. Her face was pale in that careful way children get when they are trying not to add weight to a room already carrying too much. Are we losing the house? She asked. I looked at my daughter, at the lanterns outside. At the doorway my mother had just tried to strip from us with forged paper and borrowed authority. And I said very calmly, no. They just made a mistake they won't be able to hide. I did not call them back. I did not slam the door. I did not stand in the kitchen and shake until the glasses rattled. I relit the birthday candles, cut the cake, and sang for my daughter with frosting on my thumb and my mother's forged will still sitting in my head like a blade laid flat against bone. Ellie smiled when the girls shouted her name. But she kept looking at me between slices, checking whether my face still meant home. So I kept it steady. I handed out cake. I found the missing knife. I laughed once in the right place when one of the girls got icing on her nose. I moved through the next 40 minutes the way women move through disaster when children are watching cleanly, without spectacle, as if composure itself were a form of shelter. Mrs. Grant stayed after the other mothers left. She did not ask foolish questions. She collected empty plates, tied trash bags, and waited until Ellie had gone upstairs with her gifts before saying, "That man in the SUV wasn't just any realtor." I set the last glass in the sink. "You noticed that too. He never looked at the house," she said. "Not once. He was watching your mother." That mattered. A real buyer's agent would have glanced at the windows, the roofline, the lot, the kitchen if they got inside. He had done none of that. He had stood there like an accessory. A prop with a clipboard. Something brought to create pressure, not to conduct business. Mrs. Grant dried her hands slowly. "Do you want me to tell anyone what I saw?" "Oh, yes," I said. "But only exactly what you saw." She nodded. "Good. Exact is stronger." After she left, the house went quiet in the way. Only a house with children can suddenly, completely, with one distant drawer upstairs and then nothing. I locked the front door, checked the side gate, and stood for a moment in the hallway, looking at the pencil marks inside the pantry where Ellie and I had measured her every August since she was 6. My father had added one for himself once, joking that old age should count for something if childhood got a wall. Then my phone vibrated. It was a text from Vanessa. "You have until Wednesday." After that, we stopped being polite. No greeting. No pretense. No mention of dad, grief, family, or misunderstanding. Just pressure and timing. I did not answer. Instead, I took a clean folder from the desk in the den and wrote one word on the tab: house. Then I started building what they had assumed I would be too emotional to build. I put in the fake will details first from memory. Date, witness names, notary address, wording about my mother's authority, the mention of a buyer prepared to move quickly. Then I added the text screenshot from Vanessa, printed directly from my phone. After that, I included 3 things I already had without realizing, because caregiving makes archivists out of women. The first was my father's discharge summary from 9 days before the date on the forged will. It documented severe weakness in both hands, increasing sedation, and assistance required for basic tasks. The second was the medication log I kept on the kitchen clipboard for hospice, with times, dosages, and notes in my handwriting. On the date they claimed he signed a new will, he had needed help lifting a cup twice before noon. The third was the home care aid schedule showing exactly who had been in the house that week and when. Facts, not outrage. At 8:17 p.m., another message came. This time from my mother. If you force this into court, everything from your father's final months will become part of the record. I stared at that for a long moment. That was not the message of a grieving widow trying to clarify a legal misunderstanding. That was a warning from someone who believed exposure itself was leverage. She expected me to fear scrutiny because she assumed guilt belonged to the person who had been closest to the dying man. It was an old tactic. Make the caregiver look controlling. Make the daughter look manipulative. Suggest influence without proving it. Use exhaustion as a stain. I added the screenshot to the folder. At 8:31, Ellie came downstairs in socks and one of the oversized birthday t-shirts her friend had given her. She stood in the doorway of the den and looked at the papers spread across the desk. "Are you working?" she asked. "Yes." "On them?" I nodded. She came closer and picked up the ribbon from one of her gift bags, winding it around 2 fingers until it went tight. Grandma sounded like she already knew she could do it. There it was. The first clean truth from the person in the house least interested in performance. She sounded prepared, I said. Ellie looked at the folder, then at me. That means she planned it before today. Children do not always know legal language, but they understand intent faster than adults do. Yes, I said, it does. She absorbed that in silence. Then she asked, "Is that why she came when my friends were here?" I pulled out the chair beside me. She sat, still holding the ribbon. "Yes," I said again. "People choose witnesses when they think witnesses will help them." Her mouth tightened in a way that looked too old for 12. "Did she think I'd tell everyone you were lying?" "No." I kept my voice even. "I think she thought I would break in front of people." Ellie looked down at the desk. "You didn't." "No." She nodded once, like she had needed that confirmed, then got up and went back upstairs. Halfway to the landing, she turned and asked, "Was Grandpa ever going to leave us?" "Not the house, us." That was the real question under all of it. "No," I said. "He wasn't." When she was gone, I sat very still for a minute. Then I opened my laptop and searched the notary listed on the forged will. The address matched a strip office on the west side. The license number, however, did not match the name printed under the stamp. The number belonged to a woman whose commission had expired the year before. I did not let myself feel triumph. Too early. I printed that page and added it to the folder. At 9:12 p.m., a third message arrived. This one from a number I did not know. "This is Daniel Mercer. I was given your information regarding the property on Hawthorne Lane. My clients are hoping for a smooth transfer. Please advise your timeline for vacating." My clients, plural, not seller, not estate representative, not executor. My clients. I read the message twice, then a third time, slower. The man with the clipboard had not been there by accident. He had not been standing by for a possible future listing. Someone had already spoken to him as if control of my house was established. Enough for him to contact me directly the same night. Enough for him to use transfer and vacating in the first message. Enough for him to think I was the delay, rather than the occupant of lawfully inherited property. That was the first sign beneath the forged will itself, that today had not been an impulsive act of greed. It had structure, timeline, outside participation. They had lined up pressure before they lined up truth. I did not reply to him either. Instead, I opened my contacts, found the number I had saved 3 years earlier after my divorce, and pressed call. Rachel Bell's office, a woman answered. This is Lydia Marin, I said. I need to see Miss Bell first thing in the morning. It's about a forged will and an attempted property seizure. There was a brief pause. The kind that happens when a receptionist realizes a situation is either exaggerated or very real. Can you come at 9? She asked. Yes. She gave me the address, though I already knew it, and told me to bring every document I had. When I ended the call, the house was quiet again. Outside, one paper lantern had come loose and was tapping gently against the patio beam in the night breeze. I went to the back door and stood there looking at the yard where my mother had tried to strip my life down to a transaction before cake had even been served. On the kitchen counter, beside the stack of unopened birthday cards, my phone lit up one more time. Vanessa, you should be smart for once and leave before this gets public. I looked at the words, then at the folder on the table thickening by the hour. They still thought public was the threat. That told me everything I needed to know about how badly they had misread who they were dealing with. Rachel Bell knew the will was wrong before she finished the second page. She read it once, checked the signature, then looked at me and asked, Did they present this in public? Yes. In front of witnesses? Yes. Good, she said. That was all. No sympathy performance, no long warning. Just the first sign I had brought the papers to the right woman. Her office was quiet, glass-walled, exact. Rachel had the kind of control that made everyone else speak more carefully. She laid the forged will beside my father's real estate papers and told me to walk her through the date on the document minute by minute. So I did. I told her what my father could do that week and what he could not. I told her about the morphine, the weakness in his hands, the discharge notes, the home care aid schedule, and the fact that 8 days before he died, he could not sign a grocery receipt without bracing his wrist on the table. I gave her Vanessa's text, my mother's threat, and the broker's message about a smooth transfer. Rachel listened without interrupting. Then she turned to the notary block. This helps, she said. The notary number on the forged will did not belong to the woman named under the stamp. Worse, the commission tied to that number had already expired. Rachel printed the licensing record and set it on top of the will. That was the first hard break in their story. Not grief, not confusion, not a family dispute over what Dad really wanted. A defective legal instrument with a false notary trail. Then she asked for my father's real estate file. I gave her the copy of his actual will from the fireproof box. She placed both documents side by side and studied the signatures in silence. My father's real signature slanted slightly upward at the end. Even when arthritis made it uneven, the motion stayed loose. The forged one was heavier, slower, almost careful in the wrong places. It looked like someone had copied the shape without knowing the hand. Rachel circled the middle stroke with her pen. See this? She asked. This isn't age. This is imitation. I leaned in. Once she said it, I could not stop seeing it. Then she opened the real will. My father had not left the house under my mother's authority at all. He had transferred it directly to me, with protective language for Ellie, if anything ever happened to me while she was still young. Clean structure. No shared control. No discretionary power from my mother. No ambiguity. Rachel turned the page toward me so I could read the clause again. He didn't just leave you the house, she said. He structured it to stay stable. That changed something in me. Until then, I had been angry that they came after my home. Now I understood they had tried to override a system my father built on purpose to protect me and my daughter. They had not merely lied. They had tried to replace his judgment with their appetite. Rachel leaned back in her chair. They were counting on speed. Intimidation. Your grief. That's why they came to your house in public. They wanted you pressured before you ever examined the document. She was right. The birthday party had not been cruelty for its own sake. It was tactic. Witnesses for humiliation. Children for emotional pressure. A broker for artificial legitimacy. Urgency before scrutiny. Then she asked, Did anyone outside the family act on this? Yes, I said. The broker texted me that same night. He asked for my timeline for vacating. Her expression sharpened for the first time. Good, she said again. But this time, it meant something else. Expansion. Footprint. Proof that they had moved beyond private fantasy and into attempted execution. She searched his name while I sat there. Daniel Mercer. Mid-size brokerage. Recent estate sales. One prior deal connected to Vanessa's husband's business circle. Not proof of conspiracy, but proof that this was not random. Rachel drafted 2 letters immediately. The first went to my mother and Vanessa, ordering preservation of every communication, draft, text, email, witness contact, and document connected to any supposed change in my father's estate, or any attempt to market the property. The second went to Daniel Mercer and his brokerage, warning them that the will presented to me was facially defective, and that any listing, pre-marketing, buyer outreach, or interference with my possession would trigger legal action. Pressure. Answered with structure. Before I left, Rachel asked one more question. Who saw them present the will? I gave her every name. Mrs. Grant, the 2 mothers on the patio, the broker, Ellie, before I sent her outside. Get statements today, Rachel said. Exact wording only. No emotion. Freeze the scene before anyone edits it. So I did. Mrs. Grant wrote hers at my kitchen table. She stated that my mother arrived with a folder, declared that the house had not been left to me, mentioned a buyer, and brought a man with a clipboard. She noted that Vanessa told me not to make a scene. She noted that I remained calm. The other mothers sent theirs by email before dinner. Same key points. Same timeline. Same pressure. Same mention of a buyer. Before any lawful transfer had happened. By early evening, Rachel called. We have confirmation, she said. The woman whose expired license number appeared on the forged will had already responded. She had never notarized my father's signature. She had never met him. She had not authorized anyone to use her credentials. I sat down on the edge of Ellie's bed because standing suddenly felt unnecessary. Can she say that formally? I asked. She already has, Rachel said. Signed declaration. That was it. The first hard proof of deliberate betrayal. Someone had taken a false notary trail, a forged signature, and a fabricated authority claim, then carried it to my front door in broad daylight to push me out of the house my father had legally secured for me and Ellie. When I ended the call, Ellie was downstairs doing homework at the dining table. I sat beside her first, helped her with 2 history questions, and only then told her the truth. The paper Grandma brought was fake. She looked at me carefully. Actually fake? Yes. She nodded once, slow and unsurprised. I knew it. How? She kept her eyes on the worksheet. Aunt Vanessa smiled like she already knew the ending. I looked at my daughter, at her pencil, at the birthday balloons still losing air near the kitchen doorway. Children do not need legal language to recognize a setup. And that was the worst part of all. By 12, Ellie already knew the difference between family arriving in grief and family arriving to take. By the second day, the forged will had stopped feeling like the center of the case. It was only the bait. The real structure was sitting in my father's records, stamped, filed, and far harder to touch than my mother and sister seemed to understand. Rachel had told me to stop thinking like a daughter being cornered and start thinking like a custodian of proof. So I turned the den into a paper trail. Estate documents on one side, hospice records on the other, screenshots, property tax notices, account summaries, and the old accordion file my father used to keep labeled in block letters so exact they felt almost military. That was where I found the first thing that changed the shape of everything. A recorded transfer on death deed. Not a promise. Not a note. Not a vague line buried in a will. A properly filed county record. Executed 6 months before my father died, transferring the house directly to me upon his death. My name was there in plain language. No authority granted to my mother. No discretion left to family interpretation. No distribution to be decided later. I scanned it and sent it to Rachel. She called within minutes. "This is excellent," she said. "The house did not need probate to pass to you." I looked down at the deed again, at the recording stamp, at the legal description of the property, at my father's real signature from a time when his hand was still steady. So the forged will couldn't even do what they claimed? "Not without frightening you into acting against your own position first," Rachel said. "Which means what they brought to your front door was not legal control. It was pressure dressed as legal control." That was the first structural reveal. The forged will was never enough on its own. It only worked if I panicked, moved out, signed something careless, or let outside people treat me like a temporary obstacle instead of the lawful owner. They had not arrived with law. They had arrived with performance. Rachel told me to keep going. Check for title activity, brokerage contact, utility changes, lender inquiries, anything suggesting they were trying to operationalize this before they had a right to. So I did. The county property portal showed no change after the transfer on death deed. Good. Utilities were still in proper order. No service transfers. No account changes. But in my email, buried under school notices and pharmacy reminders, I found something I had ignored 2 days earlier because it looked generic and intrusive. A title company message. It asked whether I had any anticipated timeline for vacating the property in connection with a pending estate sale coordination. I read it twice, then forwarded it to Rachel. She called back sharper this time. "There it is," she said. They started building a transaction trail before they had lawful control. Broker. Title company. Buyer language. Vacating timeline. The birthday confrontation had not been the beginning. It had been the pressure point in the middle of a process already moving behind my back. Rachel told me to look at financial records next. Not because the house could be transferred through a bank account, but because people willing to forge one document often leave fingerprints in adjacent systems. So I went through my father's final account records line by line. Most of it was clean. Pharmacy balances, utility payments, funeral expenses. Then I found a line item from 2 weeks before his death. Cashier's check requested in person, voided the next day after signature verification failed. I stopped breathing for a second. My father had not been able to appear in person that week. I knew where he was every hour. He had barely been able to move from bed to chair. I called the branch manager and explained that council was reviewing end-of-life estate activity. She would not say much, but she said enough. The request had failed because the presenter did not match the signature card closely enough. Internal notes mentioned that a family member was present. I wrote down every word and sent it to Rachel. That was the second structural reveal. The forged will was not a standalone act. It belonged to a pattern. Maybe they had tested the bank first. Maybe they had tried to see how much of my father's life could be moved by confidence, family title, and selective paperwork. Either way, by the time they came to my daughter's birthday party, they were not improvising. They were escalating. Rachel came by the house that evening. Ellie was at the kitchen table doing math homework, erasing holes into the page, while Rachel reviewed the deed, the title email, the banknote, and Daniel Mercer's preservation response from his brokerage. He had not admitted wrongdoing. Of course not. But he had confirmed enough. He had been contacted about possible future marketing of the property before Ellie's birthday. Possible future marketing. Before they ever handed me the forged will. Rachel slid the page across the table. That matters. Because it proved intention. Not confusion after a death. Not family disagreement over what Dad meant. They were already speaking to outside parties as though my removal was expected. They were preparing the sale before they had control, I said. Yes, Rachel said. Which tells us the objective was never clarification. It was conversion. The word was cold, but accurate. I looked into the kitchen where Ellie sat bent over fractions, one sock half off her heel, birthday balloons already losing air near the back door. On paper, this was a property dispute. In reality, it was an attack on continuity. This house was Ellie's school district, her medical records, her library card, her room, her garden patch, her hallway light during storms. It was the one stable structure left after my marriage collapsed and my father got sick. My mother and sister had not just tried to seize an asset. They had aimed at the framework that kept my daughter's life from being torn apart twice. Rachel opened one final document from the title company Trace. It was not a full listing agreement, but it was enough to show where they were headed. Estimated sale range, occupancy assumptions, and a note under seller coordination that read, "Occupant expected to vacate voluntarily." I stared at that line. Occupant. Not daughter. Not beneficiary. Not lawful owner. Occupant. Someone had already reduced me to removable friction inside my own home. I set the page down and Rachel outlined the next steps without raising her voice. Confirm title formally. Freeze any interference with possession. Preserve brokerage and title communications. Subpoena what they would not hand over voluntarily. Build the case around deliberate interference with an existing legal protection, not just around the fake will itself. That was when I understood the real shape of what my father had done. He had not simply left me a house. He had built a structure meant to survive exactly this kind of family greed. My mother and Vanessa came to my door with forged paper, a broker, and enough confidence to humiliate me in public. But the real power was not in what they carried. It was in what my father had already recorded months earlier, quietly, legally, and in a form that did not need anyone's permission to hold. The worst part was not the forged will. It was realizing they had started building the lie while I was still trusting them in my kitchen. Once Rachel pushed me to think in sequence instead of shock, I stopped asking only what my mother and Vanessa had done. I started asking when. Fraud always looks different once you line up dates, visits, texts, access logs, and the small practical questions people ask before they make a move. So I rebuilt the final months of my father's life. Not emotionally. Logistically, I went through call logs, garage records, calendar entries, hospice schedules, pharmacy receipts, and the notes I had kept during his care. At first it all looked like exhaustion on paper. Then another pattern came through. My mother and sister became more present only after my father's doctor told us treatment was no longer curative. Before that, they visited lightly. Short calls, grocery store flowers. A casserole dropped off with just enough sympathy to be seen. But once comfort care became the language around him, their timing changed. Vanessa started coming by in the afternoons to help, though most of what she did was stand in doorways and ask practical questions that did not feel practical at all. Where did Dad keep the house papers now? Was the mortgage completely paid off? Did I have a backup set of keys? Had Dad ever updated anything to make things easier later? At the time, I heard selfishness. Now I heard reconnaissance. My mother was subtler. She stopped criticizing my caregiving and started praising it. That should have warned me more than cruelty ever could have. She had spent years turning my competence into a flaw. If I handled things well, she called me controlling. If I stayed organized, she called me rigid. Then suddenly, during my father's decline, she started saying, "No one could have managed this the way you have. And, your father is lucky you stayed." At the time, I took the praise because I was too tired not to. Later, I understood what it was for. She needed me stable, busy, trusting. She needed me to keep the house running while she learned where everything was. One memory came back with ugly clarity. About a month before my father died, Vanessa sat at my kitchen table pretending to help Ellie with a science worksheet. My father was asleep in the living room with a blanket over his knees. I was rinsing rice at the sink when Vanessa looked at his key ring on the counter and said almost casually, "You should really duplicate everything now. Emergencies get messy." I asked, "Everything?" "Keys. Files. Access," she said. "In case you get overwhelmed." My father opened his eyes just enough to say, "Lydia handles what needs handling." Vanessa smiled. But later that night I found his keys moved from the counter to the den desk. A small thing on its own. Not small once everything else started lining up. Then I checked the garage access history. My mother's old clicker had opened the garage twice after midnight in the final month of my father's life on dates she later claimed she had not come by. That was another piece. Not enough to win a case by itself. Enough to show quiet access, where there should have been none. Then I found something worse. Buried in my father's archived email was a message from a small estate planning office, thanking him for stopping by and offering to review revised distribution preferences once all attending family members were available. My father had not stopped by anywhere. Not in that condition. Not that week. I sent it to Rachel. She called and said, "Even if the office did nothing wrong, this helps. Someone was testing revision language before your father died." That was when the moral shape of it came clear. They were not reacting after his death. They were preparing while he was still alive. While I was managing morphine schedules, while I was washing his sheets, while I was helping him into the shower because he hated strangers seeing him weak. Then another memory surfaced, and this one hurt more because I had heard it and missed it. 3 weeks before he died, my mother sat beside him with a container of soup and said softly, "You need to think about making things easier for the girls after you're gone." My father looked at her and said, "I already have." She smiled and replied, "I mean truly easier. Not everything should rest in one set of hands." At the time, I heard criticism. Now I heard testing. My father looked past her toward Ellie on the rug, sorting colored pencils by shade, and said, "Some hands hold, some hands take." My mother laughed like he had said something vague and old. He had not. He knew more than I understood then. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not the forged will or the broker. But enough to record the transfer on death deed months before he died. Enough to keep the structure clean. Enough to protect the house from exactly the people smiling in his living room. The next morning, Ellie gave me another piece without knowing it. She was eating cereal quietly, moving Cheerios around the edge of the bowl when she asked, "Did Grandma come around more when Grandpa got sick because she cared more or because of the house?" Children ask the truest question first. I told her, "I think she cared about control." Ellie nodded and said, "She asked me weird things." I looked up. "What kind of things?" She asked if Grandpa still kept folders in the den cabinet, and once she asked if the garage code was your birthday or mine. The room went still. "When was that?" I asked. "Before his last hospital trip," Ellie said. My mother had been questioning a child for access information while I was upstairs helping her dying husband breathe through pain. That was a line no legal filing could fully describe. After school drop-off, I found the final piece in the most ordinary place in the house. The kitchen drawer where my father kept recipe cards and garden notes. Folded between them was a sheet of legal pad paper in Vanessa's handwriting. Not a formal document, just bullet points. A script. Dad wanted fairness. Lydia emotional lately. Too much influence in-house. Easier if transition framed as temporary. Mention Ellie stability. Say buyer already interested. I stood there with the page in my hand and felt something inside me go completely still. There it was. Not the whole fraud. Not enough to prove every element by itself, but enough to prove intent. They had planned the narrative before they forced the scene. They had thought through the pressure points. My grief, my daughter, my exhaustion, the idea of a temporary move, the existence of a buyer, the suggestion that staying in my own home was selfish instability. They had written the story first. The forged will came after. I photographed the page and sent it to Rachel. She called later and said, "Keep the original untouched. This gives us intent. Maybe not alone, but with everything else. It matters." She was right. Part 4 had shown me the legal structure. Part 5 showed me something worse. My mother and sister were not overtaken by grief after my father died. They were active before he died. While I still let Vanessa sit at my table, while Ellie answered harmless questions, while my mother moved through the kitchen like she still belonged there, while my father, already dying, was trying to protect the house quietly enough that peace might survive him. That night I made pasta because Ellie always ate pasta when she was anxious. She sat at the counter pulling Parmesan into neat little piles and asked, "Does Rachel think we're going to win?" "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Does winning mean they go away?" I set her bowl in front of her and answered carefully, "It means they don't get to decide what our life is anymore." Ellie nodded and started eating. Later, after she went upstairs, I stood in the den looking at the files. The deed, the fake will, the title message, the banknote, the access log, the witness statements, Vanessa's handwritten script. The forged will was the crime. But the deeper betrayal was this. They had started building the theft while I still believed we were standing inside the same grief. By Friday, they stopped pushing in private and started shaping the room around me. Until then, everything had been pressure through documents, timing, and fake authority. The forged will, the broker, the title inquiry, the hints that I should cooperate before things got difficult. But once Rachel's preservation letters went out, my mother and Vanessa changed tactics. They went social first. That morning, a woman from my father's old church circle called and asked, too carefully, whether I was holding up under all the estate conflict. I asked what she meant. She hesitated, then said my mother had mentioned that I was struggling to accept my father's final wishes and that things had become painful for everyone. There it was. Not fraud. Not a forged will. Not an attempted seizure of my home. Just me, softened into a selfish daughter who would not let go. By noon, 2 more versions reached me. A cousin texted to ask whether I was really planning to take the family to court over property. Another relative asked if it was true Ellie had been present for an ugly confrontation because I refused to cooperate. Same shape. Same language. They were building a social version of the lie before any judge saw the legal one. Rachel told me not to answer a single person. Good, she said when I forwarded the screenshots. I was beginning to understand her use of that word. Good meant usable. Good meant they were making mistakes in ways that could be preserved. Then my mother left me a voicemail. It was calm, slow, almost tender if you did not know her. Lydia, no one is trying to hurt you. We are trying to resolve your father's intentions with dignity. Ellie does not need to be in the middle of your instability. Please call me before you make this worse for everyone. I listened once. Then again. Every word had a job. Dignity. Instability. Everyone. She was no longer speaking to me. She was speaking for replay. For forwarding. For any future ear that might hear only tone and miss the threat under it. Rachel saved the audio and said, "She's building herself into the reasonable mother. Let her." That afternoon, the damage reached Ellie. She came home from school too quiet. I knew something had happened before she said a word. Kids carry humiliation differently from adults. Adults get louder or colder. Children get careful. I waited until she put her backpack down. What happened? She shrugged. Nothing. I said nothing back. After a moment, she stared at the floor and said, Ava said her mom heard we might be moving because Grandma told people the house isn't really ours. The anger that came then was not sharp. It settled. They had moved past me and into my daughter's day. Not directly. They were too practiced for that. Women like my mother do not poison a child in a form that can be quoted cleanly. They let it travel through parking lot talk, church concern, and other mothers until it reaches school as rumor wearing adult clothes. I crouched in front of Ellie and asked, "What did you say?" That it wasn't true. And then? I stayed in the bathroom until lunch. I nodded once. Okay. She looked at me and asked, "Are they allowed to do that?" No judge was standing in my kitchen. No statute was going to repair the fact that a 12-year-old had hidden in a school bathroom because her grandmother wanted pressure to spread faster than facts. They're allowed to talk, I said carefully. They are not allowed to decide what's true. That evening I made grilled cheese and tomato soup because simple food is what a changed house can still manage. Ellie sat at the counter dipping bread into soup until it went soft and asked whether people would believe Grandma because she was older. Some will, I said. Because easy stories travel faster. That's not fair. No, I said. It isn't. By Saturday morning, the escalation turned formal. A process server came to the house just after 9 with a petition for emergency review of estate concerns and a request for supervised access to what they now called disputed family property. The language was careful, concern, preservation, access, emotional obstruction. They still could not prove ownership. So they were trying to create a cloud around possession. Not give us the house. Give us supervised access. Not Lydia is lawful owner. Lydia is making administration difficult. It was cleaner than the birthday scene. More dangerous, too, because paper filed in court looks respectable even when it is built on omission. Rachel came over within an hour, read the petition once, and set it on the kitchen table. They've decided to overplay, she said. How? They're arguing around structure instead of through it. Then she showed me exactly what she meant. Their filing never mentioned the recorded transfer on death deed. It referred to the house as part of the estate environment, which was evasive enough to sound almost invented. It leaned heavily on family conflict and alleged concern, but gave no clean chain of authority, no explanation for the defective notary trail, and no reason a broker and title company had entered the picture before lawful control existed. They were not trying to win on substance. They were trying to make the room feel uncertain. Rachel liked that. Judges do not enjoy manufactured emergencies, she said, especially when the papers are selective. Within hours, she filed our response. The deed, the real will, the notary declaration, witness statements from the birthday party, the title company email, the broker contact, and my mother's voicemail about my instability. No emotional speech, no outrage, just sequence and structure. Later that afternoon, my mother came to the house alone. No broker this time. No Vanessa. Just my mother in a navy coat, hair perfect, face arranged into disappointed restraint. I saw her through the front window before she rang the bell. I opened the door, but not enough to invite anything in. I thought you'd have more sense than to stop this before it got filed, she said. You served me at my house, I said. You forced that. No, I said. You forged that. For the first time, her face changed. Be careful, she said quietly. Once the court starts asking questions about your father's final months, you may not like how much of your behavior gets examined. There it was again. The old family weapon. Turn care into suspicion. Turn the daughter who stayed into the daughter who had too much access. Pretend proximity itself is guilt. I kept one hand on the door. You should leave. She leaned forward slightly. You think that lawyer can protect you from what people will say once they understand how much control you had over him? I looked at her for a long second and said, You made a mistake confusing access with ownership. That landed. She stepped back, eyes hard now. Vanessa was right. You always know how to make yourself look like the victim. I answered, and you always need an audience. Then I closed the door. Not hard. Final. When I turned around, Ellie was standing at the end of the hallway. How much did you hear? I asked. Enough. I nodded. Do you want to go to Nora's for a while? She shook her head. I want to stay here. Of course she did. That was what this had always been about. Not just a house. Not just money. Staying inside the one place where our life still held its shape. Rachel called just before 6. They got a Monday appearance on the temporary access issue, she said. We'll be there first. I looked around the kitchen while she spoke. Ellie's homework packet. My father's old clock over the pantry. The grocery list held to the fridge by a tomato magnet. The ordinary domestic evidence my mother and sister kept trying to reduce to occupancy. Good, I said. And this time I meant it the way Rachel did. Because by then they had escalated socially, legally, and psychologically. They had touched church, school, court, and my daughter. They had tried to make me defend my existence inside my own home, but every move they made left a record. And records are harder to manipulate than relatives. Monday morning, my mother arrived at the courthouse dressed like the victim of my ingratitude. Vanessa was beside her in ivory silk, carrying a leather portfolio and the kind of expression people wear when they have already rehearsed being right. Daniel Mercer was there too, standing near the back in a navy suit that said he understood exactly how far he could drift from the center if things went badly. 2 of my cousins had shown up. So had one woman from church. Not because they knew the facts, because they had been invited to witness a story. Rachel saw all of it in one glance and said, Good. More eyes. That hearing was supposed to be about temporary access. That was how they framed it. Family concern. Preservation of sentimental items. Tension around a disputed house. They wanted the judge to feel confusion before she felt structure. If they could make the room believe there was a cloud over ownership, then supervised access would sound humane instead of strategic. Once people get inside a house under court language, they begin touching drawers, files, boxes, safes, cabinets, records. Access becomes opportunity. Rachel knew that too. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, and already too warm by 9. Ellie was not there. I had left her with Nora before sunrise because some rooms do not deserve a child. But I carried her with me anyway. In the practical way, mothers carry children even when their hands are empty. In my mind, I could still see her sitting at the kitchen counter, asking whether people would believe Grandma because she was older. My mother took her seat and folded her hands like a woman wronged by chaos. I took mine beside Rachel and said nothing. Their attorney went first. He was cautious, polished, and careful not to overclaim. That told me he had not been given a clean case and knew it. He spoke about family distress, uncertainty regarding testamentary intentions, and the need to preserve estate harmony while disputed documents are reviewed. He referred to the house as a sensitive family property. He said my mother sought only reasonable supervised access to retrieve keepsakes and prevent deterioration while legal questions were sorted. Reasonable, supervised, keepsakes. A thief's language improves when a lawyer sands it down. Then he made the mistake Rachel had been waiting for. He referred to my mother as acting in line with the decedent's final estate plan. Rachel did not move. She simply slid one tab document from the stack in front of her and wrote 3 words on her yellow pad. There it is. When it was her turn, she stood without drama and began where real control always begins, with what had already been recorded before any of them started performing grief. She handed up the transfer on death deed first. Not the forged will. Not my mother's voicemail. Not Vanessa's script notes. The deed, county stamped. Executed months before my father died. Direct transfer to me. No probate dependency. No authority vested in my mother. No discretionary family control. Rachel walked the judge through it in 4 clean minutes. Not flourish. Not indignation. Just chain of title. Recording date. Legal effect. The judge's expression changed almost immediately. I saw it happen the way you see weather move across a field. Mild attention turning into sharpened concentration. Then Rachel handed up my father's actual will, the one consistent with the deed, with protective language for Ellie if anything happened to me while she was still young. Again, no authority for my mother, no ambiguity to rescue, no family distribution role for Vanessa to hide inside. Then came the forged will. Rachel did not call it outrageous. She did not call it cruel. She called it a facially defective instrument presented in public by adverse family members in an attempt to pressure the lawful transferee of recorded property. That was better. Because outrage invites debate. Structure does not. She handed up the notary declaration next. The license number on the forged will belong to a different woman whose commission had expired. That woman had submitted a signed statement confirming she never notarized my father's signature, never met him, and never authorized use of her credentials. The courtroom went very still. Their attorney shifted for the first time. My mother remained upright, but something in her face tightened around the mouth. Vanessa stopped looking outward and began staring at the table in front of her, as if the grain in the wood had suddenly become demanding. Rachel was not finished. She introduced the witness statements from Ellie's birthday party. My mother arriving with the forged will. Vanessa warning me not to make a scene. The mention of a buyer. The presence of Daniel Mercer with a clipboard. And the immediate demand that I cooperate and vacate. Then she submitted the title company email, asking for my timeline for vacating in connection with pending estate sale coordination, along with Mercer's own preserved response confirming he had been contacted about possible future marketing before the birthday confrontation ever happened. That was the break. Not emotional. Narrative. Until that moment, my mother and sister had been trying to cast the case as a family misunderstanding inflamed by my refusal to accept grief. But now the sequence sat in front of the judge in plain order. Recorded deed, lawful transfer, fake will, false notary trail, public pressure, outside sale coordination, then emergency filing once counsel intervened. A setup. Visible at last in a room built for records. Their attorney asked for a brief recess. The judge said no. Then she looked directly at opposing counsel and asked the question that stripped all the softness off their position. Counsel, on what legal basis does your client seek access to property that appears to have passed outside probate by recorded transfer? There are moments when a case turns not because someone says something brilliant, but because one side can no longer survive the sentence already spoken into the record. Their attorney tried anyway. He said there remained open questions about the decedent's condition and possible influence in his final months. Rachel was ready for that too. She handed up the hospice records, discharge notes, medication logs, and home care schedule. Not to prove my purity. To destroy their timing. The forged will was dated 8 days before my father died during a period when records showed profound weakness, sedation, and impaired hand function. Then Rachel added my mother's voicemail warning that my instability would make things worse, and Vanessa's text demanding that I leave before the matter became public. Not grief. Not concern. Pressure. Their attorney made one last attempt to recover by suggesting that family members may have misunderstood evolving documents. Rachel answered with the line that ended them. This was not confusion, she said. This was attempted displacement. The judge looked down at the papers for a long moment. Then she asked whether Daniel Mercer was present. He was. He stood reluctantly when called. And for the first time since I had seen him on my driveway with his clipboard, he looked like what he actually was in this story. Not a neutral professional, not a distant broker, but a man who had stepped into a family fraud because someone made it sound orderly enough. Under the judge's questions, his language thinned fast. He admitted he had been contacted before the birthday. Admitted he had understood there might be a transition issue. Admitted he sent me a message about vacating based on information supplied by family members before he had reviewed a complete title chain. Admitted he never saw a recorded deed before making that contact. That was enough. Not criminal enough for handcuffs in a morning hearing, but enough for collapse. Because once he admitted that, the room understood what kind of theater had been staged on my driveway. Clipboard. Buyer language. Vacating timeline. They had dressed appetite in process and hoped nobody would ask where lawful control actually lived. The judge denied their request for access from the bench. Not with anger, with precision. She found no credible basis for emergency intrusion into property, apparently transferred outside probate. She noted the serious concerns raised by the defective will and notary irregularities. She warned all parties against interference, harassment, or informal attempts to pressure possession pending full review. Then, without raising her voice, she referred the forged instrument issue for further examination. Further examination. That phrase hit my mother harder than any speech could have. Vanessa looked at her then, really looked at her, and I saw the first true crack between them. Not loyalty breaking yet. Fear measuring blame. The hearing should have ended there, but the final collapse happened outside the courtroom. When we stepped into the hall, the churchwoman who had come to watch avoided my mother entirely. One cousin muttered, "You said the house was in the estate." Daniel Mercer walked straight past Vanessa without speaking to her. Their attorney peeled off toward the elevator with the stiff, distant body language of a man already regretting his client intake. And my mother, who had arrived dressed for moral authority, found herself standing in open public silence with no one stepping close enough to share it. She turned toward me then. Maybe she wanted one last private threat. Maybe one last appeal. Maybe simply proof that she could still provoke reaction. What she got instead was Rachel. My lawyer stepped between us just enough to make the line clear and said, "Do not contact my client except through counsel." My mother looked at me over Rachel's shoulder. "You've humiliated this family." I met her eyes and answered in the same calm voice I had used on the driveway. "No. I documented it. That was all. No speech, no shaking hands, no revenge. Just the truth. Finally standing in public where their story used to be. And for the first time since my father died, People saw the shape of the family exactly as it was. The woman who had stayed, the women who had come to take, and the structure that had outlived their performance. After the hearing, the house became quiet in a different way. Not the strained quiet of waiting, not the procedural quiet of folders opening and closing on the den desk. A deeper one. The kind that comes after a false story loses oxygen. No one came to the door that week. No more church calls arrived. No cousins texted me careful questions about family peace. Daniel Mercer's brokerage sent a formal notice, confirming it would have no further involvement with the property. The title company closed its internal file. Rachel forwarded both with one-line notes and no extra emotion. She did not need any. The structure was speaking by then. My mother tried once more, but only once. A sympathy card arrived by mail in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a short note in her handwriting. I never wanted this to become public. No apology, no acknowledgement of the forged will, no mention of Ellie, no grief for the man whose death they had tried to convert into leverage. Just regret that exposure had happened on terms she did not control. I handed the card to Rachel. She added it to the file and said, "That's not remorse. That's loss of narrative control." She was right. By then, the case had stopped being about whether I could hold the house. That question had already been answered by the deed, the hearing, and the silence that followed. What changed instead was the social architecture around my mother and Vanessa. People withdrew, not in dramatic confrontations, in smaller, truer ways. My cousin Dana, who had repeated one of my mother's early claims, called to apologize and spoke too quickly, the way people do when shame is chasing them. A woman from church left a casserole on the porch with a note that said only, "Thinking of you and Ellie. Mrs. Grant." Stopped referring to my mother as your mother at all, and started calling her that woman, which was immature, technically, and comforting anyway. Vanessa did not apologize. She sent one text 3 days after the hearing. I didn't know Mom had gone that far. I read it twice and deleted nothing. Not because I believed her. I did not. The handwritten bullet point script in her own hand had cured me of that. But because I had finally learned the difference between a confession and an exit strategy. Vanessa was not stepping into truth. She was stepping backward from impact, trying to leave herself one clean inch of floor to stand on if my mother fell through. I did not answer. That was the new shape of things. I no longer argued where records had already spoken. The second week, I took down the birthday lanterns. They had stayed up too long because I had not wanted to admit how much of that day had been split open. Ellie helped me from the step stool, handing me each ribbon one by one. We worked mostly in silence. Not heavy silence. Working silence. When we finished, she asked, "Does this mean it's over?" I looked at the bare patio beam where the last lantern had hung. "It means they can't move us with lies." Ellie considered that. "That's not exactly the same thing." No, it wasn't. Children understand finality better than adults pretend they do. She knew hearings end before relationships do. She knew winning in court did not rewind what she had heard at school or erase the sight of her grandmother standing in our driveway with a forged will in her hand. So I gave her the truer answer. "It means we don't have to keep proving what's ours." She nodded. That was enough for her. One evening after homework, she asked if we could open the hall closet and go through Grandpa's gardening gloves. She wanted to keep one pair because they still smelled faintly like tomato leaves if you held them close enough. We sat on the hallway floor with a box between us, twine, seed packets, old receipts from the nursery, a bent pair of pruning shears, his notebook with weather dates written in tiny, careful numbers. Nothing explosive happened. That was the point. A house becomes yours again through ordinary use long before any formal file closes. I kept making dinner. Ellie kept forgetting one sock in the living room. The pantry door still held our height marks. The tomato magnet stayed on the fridge over grocery lists and school notices. Rachel continued moving the legal side forward with the same calm efficiency, but she no longer had to reassure me. There was nothing left to reassure. The deed existed. The record existed. The judge had seen enough. Further review would move at its own pace, but the center had already held. The deeper aftermath came in a smaller scene. A Thursday night storm rolled in just after 10. One of those spring storms that makes the windows breathe in their frames. A year earlier, Ellie would have come downstairs with her blanket and asked to sleep on the couch. That night, she opened her bedroom door, looked down the hallway toward me, and then closed it again. In the morning, I asked, "You stayed in your room?" She poured cereal and said, "I knew we weren't going anywhere." That nearly undid me more than the hearing had, because that was what the house had always meant beneath the paperwork. The forged signatures, the title inquiries, the courtroom language, the neighbor statements, the strategic cruelty. Not value, not victory, steadiness. My father had understood that before anyone else. Long before my mother arrived with her folder and her performance, long before Vanessa wrote notes about framing me as emotional, long before Rachel put the legal structure into words sharp enough for a judge to hold, my father had already seen the real risk. He knew the house was not just where I lived. It was where the line of safety for Ellie continued. So he did what careful men do when they know love may need protection from family as much as from strangers. He put it into structure. He had not made me temporary. He had not left me dependent. He had not forgotten who stayed. He had built something that would still be true after he was gone, even if other people tried to talk over it. A few days later, I went into the den and closed the file for the first time. Not because every legal consequence in the world had finished. Life is rarely that neat. But because the purpose of the file had been met. It had carried the truth far enough that I no longer needed to hold it in my hands every day. I put the forged will copies, the witness statements, the title messages, the banknote, the voicemail transcript, and Vanessa's handwritten script into one box. Then I placed my father's real will and the recorded deed in the fireproof box where they belonged. Different categories. Different weight. Evidence in one place. Foundation in another. That felt right. On Saturday, Ellie and I planted tomatoes. The soil was still cool, and the backyard smelled like rain from the night before. She read the names from the little plastic tags in a serious voice. And I spaced the seedlings the way my father taught me: room enough for roots, room enough for air. Mrs. Grant leaned over the fence at one point and asked if we needed extra basil. Ellie said yes before I answered. We planted in companion rows. Again, nothing dramatic happened. That was the point, too. My mother and sister had tried to reduce this house to a transaction, an asset, an estate environment, a place from which an occupant could be voluntarily removed. They had arrived with forged paper, borrowed authority, and a buyer already waiting in language if not in title. They thought the power was in pressure, in public humiliation, in making me react before I had time to read what was actually true. They were wrong. The power had been in the quiet things all along. A deed recorded months earlier. A child who knew what home meant. A father who understood that some hands hold and some hands take. And a structure built carefully enough to outlast greed. That evening, after the seedlings were watered and the dishes were done, Ellie stood in the pantry doorway and put her finger beside her latest height mark. "I think I grew," she said. "You probably did. Should we measure?" I got the pencil from the junk drawer. She stood straight against the wood, chin level, heels back. I marked the line and wrote the date beside it. Then, without thinking too hard, I added one more note under my father's old joke mark from years ago. "Still here." Ellie read it and smiled. I put the pencil back, turned off the kitchen light, and looked once through the darkened house, the hallway, the den, the back door, the outline of the patio beyond the glass. No speeches were needed. No one left to convince. The house remained. So did we.